said that during the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation from their eastern homelands in 1838, that the women were overcome with sadness and despair. They could not make the 1,000-mile journey so stricken with grief. The men saw the suffering and prayed to the Great One for the strength for their women and their people. The next morning, the people saw that a flower had grown every place a woman's tear had fallen. The flowers had white petals for the purity of their sadness and loss, 7 leaves for each of the Cherokee clans, and gold centers for the greed of the white man. These flowers, Cherokee roses, still grow from North Carolina and Georgia all the way into Oklahoma, and are said to reclaim the land stolen from the Cherokee people. This forced removal would come to be known as the Trail of Tears, or as the Cherokees say, Nunya Huduna Slo He Lui, the place where they cried. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, giving him authority to remove the Native Americans of the Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. With this act in place, Jackson was able to threaten and force tribes into signing treaties, giving their land away forever. With the signing of the first treaty by the Choctaw of Mississippi, the removal began. Over the next decade, tens of thousands of Native Americans would be forced to walk one of the 4 trails leading to Indian Territory, or modern-day Oklahoma. With as little as the clothes on their backs, these tribes, the Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee, were marched over 800 miles at gunpoint. Many died from exposure, starvation, and exhaustion along the way, in one of the most shameful acts in U.S. history, known today simply as the Trail of Tears.
We're despoiled of our private possessions. We're stripped of every attribute of freedom and eligibility for legal self-defense. Our property may be plundered before our eyes. Violence may be committed on our persons. Even our lives may be taken away. Our hearts are sickened when we reflect on the condition in which we are placed by the audacious practices of unprincipled men.
You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy, the Treaty of New Echota. In the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty will stink to the world.
Cherokees, the President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army to cause you to join your people on the other side of the Mississippi. Will you then, by resistance, compel us to resort to arms? God forbid. I am an old warrior and have been present at many a scene of slaughter, but spare me, I beseech you, the horror of witnessing the destruction of the Cherokees.
After all the warning, and with the soldiers in their midst, the inevitable day appointed found the Indians at work in their houses and in their fields. 2 or 3 dropped their hoes and ran as fast as they could when they saw the soldiers coming into the field. The men handled them gently, but picked them up in the road, in the field, anywhere they found them, part of a family at a time, and carried them to a post or fort.
Considering the number and temper of the mass to be removed, it will readily occur that simple indiscretions, acts of harshness and cruelty on the part of the troops may lead in the end to a general war and carnage. Therefore, every possible kindness must therefore be shown by the troops.
The soldiers came and took us from our home. They first surrounded our house, and they took the mayor while we were at work in the fields, and they drove us out of doors and did not permit us to take anything with us, not even a second change of clothes. They drove us off to a fort that was built at New Echota.
Thus, in 2 or 3 days, about 8,000 people, many of whom were in good circumstances and some rich, were rendered homeless, houseless, and penniless, and exposed to all the ills of captivity. In driving them, a platoon of soldiers walked before and behind, and a file of soldiers on each side, armed with all the common appalling instruments of death. While the soldiers, it is said, would often use the same language as if driving hogs, and goad them forward with their bayonets. One man, on being pricked thus and seeing his children thus goaded on, picked up a stone and struck a soldier. Before this, he was handcuffed, and on arriving at the fort was punished, and on starting again was whipped 100 lashes.
At this very moment, a low sound of distant thunder fell upon my ear. In almost an exact western direction, a dark spiral cloud was rising above the horizon and sent forth a murmur. I almost fancied a voice to divine indignation for the wrongs of my poor and unhappy countrymen. Driven by brutal power and all that he loved, cherished in the land of their fathers, to gratify the cravings of avarice.
Oh, how heart-rending was the sight of those little sufferers, their little blue lips trembling with cold. We wept and wept again. Our prayer is that these dear children, who must doubtless be soon be ushered into eternity, may be taken into the arms of their Redeemer. The government might more mercifully have put to death everyone under a year or over 60 years of age. Rather, it has chosen a most expensive and painful way of exterminating these poor people.
One will not hear the anguished voice of a forgotten and broken people. Instead, one might hear the pride of a people who faced overwhelming adversity and persevered.
The Cherokee lived in the southern Appalachian Mountains, their land stretching from North and South Carolina into Tennessee, down into Georgia and Alabama, and included hunting land in Kentucky. The Cherokee Nation was large and prosperous. Strong with a wealth of natural resources, this land was a home easy to live off of. Their culture thrived for thousands of years with little outside influence. The 19th century brought missionaries, and the assimilation of the Cherokee began. Adopting European farming techniques, abandoning their religion for Christianity, forming their own government, and creating a written language set the Cherokees apart from other Native Americans, and they became known as one of the 5 civilized tribes. This, however, was not enough for the Cherokee to keep their land. The color of their skin would never change, and they would forever be considered the other.
It was in February of 1828, the first edition of our Cherokee newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, was published here at New Echota. And only 3 years before, in 1825, the National Council passed a resolution making New Echota its capital and changing its name from Newtown. Our council, however, had been meeting here since 1819 and had adopted as their main objective the preservation and protection of our remaining lands. And it was only in the previous year of 1827 that the Cherokees had held a constitutional convention here at New Echota, and it completely reorganized the Cherokee government. And then in 1828, this constitution was implemented, and John Ross was elected the first principal chief under the constitutional form of government. In that same year, the Constitution was reported in the first edition of the Cherokee Phoenix. Georgia's Governor Forsyth sent a copy of this edition of the newspaper to President John Quincy Adams, along with a memorial signed by Georgia's legislators that protested the Cherokees' continued occupancy of their ancestral homeland and demanded their removal in accordance with the Georgia Compact of 1802.
In 1828, near Ward's Creek in Dahlonega, Georgia, gold was discovered. This precious metal held no value for the Cherokee, but brought waves of European settlers looking to strike it rich.
Gold was discovered in North Georgia, so there was a huge gold rush down there. Georgia had been allowed to give all of North Georgia away in a land lottery to keep them from seceding from the Union and starting the Civil War way before it happened. So there were some really interesting things in the national politics that were going on. And we had never been allowed American citizenship, so we couldn't vote for the politicians that were in charge of what was going on and regionally. So we were caught between a rock and a hard place, basically. The people coming in to the gold rush in North Georgia just kind of overwhelmed the mountains and this whole region. We're needing a place to live, and so they were displacing us anyway.
The Cherokee people went to the Supreme Court multiple times to try and protect their land. In 1831, they based their appeal on a Georgia law prohibiting whites from living on Indian territory. The court ruled in favor of the Cherokees, but Georgia disregarded the court decision, and the president refused to enforce the law.
The Cherokees went to Washington many times and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court for their right to stay here in their homeland. They tried many different options.
But it came down to the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, not upholding the decision of the Supreme Court that the Removal Act was unconstitutional because it had only passed through Congress by one vote. Today, something like that would never be let go. It would have gone back through Senate, House, Congress. Everybody would have had to relook at it. But because Jackson was a land speculator, he and his buddies stood to gain a lot of wealth out of the Southeast if he could get rid of the Native Americans. So it wasn't only the Cherokee, it was a policy to remove all natives out of the Southeast. And removal or displacement had been a policy by Europeans since they set foot on the beach first time. This was policy from the word go with the Europeans. So they had seen it work before, so they knew it'd work again. The West was unexplored and unwanted at the time, and so they felt that they were doing us a favor by putting us out there. So it was interesting. The prophets had said that this would happen thousands of years ago, and so we knew about it on the cultural level. And the traditional people were adhering to the prophets and still living very traditionally. And some of those people left, Sequoia, for instance, left with a group of people before the axe fell, so to speak, and were able to take their belongings with them and what they had.
In the summer before the Cherokee were forced to walk the Trail of Tears, many were held in internment camps. Kept against their will, many died of dysentery and other illnesses. Hundreds perished while captive.
There was actually a gathering of the Cherokee people by force. They were held in what referred to as forts, or some might refer to as a concentration camp, until the removal. There were different routes. There were three main routes. The northern route you hear the most about, and then there was, of course, a water route, and then there was a lower route. So when the Trail of Tears or the forced removal march began in May, people were actually still leaving in October, and so then by January of 1839, most of the people who'd been forced to march out were arriving in Oklahoma.
From 1760 until 1838, when the removal took place, was probably the darkest time in our history. The British burned all of our towns in the early 1760s and destroyed the sacred places, so that started the breakdown. And then in 1776, we lost all the towns again to the American Army. And then in 1838, everything was destroyed and burned again. So with, constantly burning down and destroying, we lost everything here. And what we've got left is just fragmented from what it once was.
Centuries later, the tragedy of the Trail of Tears and the history of America's indigenous populations are not willingly shared with the public. These truths must be sought out independently. The actions taken by the United States are unfathomable, unconscionable, and horrifying. The brutality of these events can be denied no more.
There's dispute about how many deaths. Any deaths were too many. Was it hundreds of deaths? Was it thousands of deaths? We grew up being told, and on many of the historic markers you'll see the number 4,000. Now that number's being disputed, but hundreds and thousands of Cherokees lost their lives. They lost their homes. They lost their heritage by having to leave Georgia. And they didn't forget. And they come back to this site on vacations. Many people from the Cherokee Nations out in Oklahoma and in Cherokee, North Carolina, come here to this area to visit. They consider this their homeland, and it is.
2013 marks 175 years since the forced removal, and many families still have living links to the Trail of Tears.
We have people who are alive who knew people that were in the removal. My grandparents' generation's grandparents were children at the time and were rounded up and removed to Oklahoma. And it gives me chills to think about him telling the story. Grandpa and I were sitting on his porch one day, and he said my grandmother was marched at gunpoint right down the road, right there in front of his house. You know, and when he said that, it all clicked. You know, this is something in our recent history that, you know, we really need to be aware of. So it's, before that, it was kind of a distant past history thing, you know. So it's interesting to talk to people like that have a really direct connection in their family lineage to the whole ordeal.
It was a very sad time. Many of our children, old people died along the trail, and in territory, we are the actual descendants of them people. They are our fifth, sixth grandparents removed, and that's not too long ago. You know, my grandpa and my great-grandfather were citizens of the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory, born in 1898. My grandfather, and many of them, you know, their grandfathers and them actually walked on the removal. It's remembering my actual blood of my fathers and grandfathers that the history of this tragedy of the Trail of Tears, it happened to my people, and we are commemorating today, 175 years later.
The Trail of Tears may conjure familiar images: wagons kicking up dust, families huddled together as they marched at gunpoint, and tears pouring from their eyes. But some say those forced to march did so in silence, and it was those who witnessed the tragedy who wept.
There were witness houses or witness churches, but along the route where people would come out and stand there, and as they saw the soldiers marching the Cherokees past, they would cry and weep. And they would also beg the soldiers, "Why are you doing this? Please don't do this." There was an internal sickness that the soldiers felt, if you read their writings. There was an internal sickness that lawmakers felt, and the citizens who watched that forced removal.
Though the atrocities committed against the Cherokees are unforgivable, they were only 10% of those removed. Dozens of tribes were forced to leave their homelands. The most well-known are those of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole. Each tribe removed has its own history and culture not to be forgotten.
I'm an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and my family was removed from Fort Mitchell, Alabama, to Oklahoma Indian Territory on the Trail of Tears. And the Muskogee people had many people who walked, thousands and thousands, of course, just like the Cherokee. And we are one of the 5 tribes that were removed from the southeast. My great-great-grandfather was given the name Samuel Chakotay, and he was the first elected chief in Oklahoma Indian Territory. He walked the Trail of Tears as a child and survived. He was an orphan. We as family members, we don't know when he became an orphan, but he was an orphan. He was a very, very gifted man. And the story of our family is that on the Trail of Tears, he was approached by some wolves. And the wolf came to him, and he was very much afraid because he was just a little boy. And yet, they did not attack him. And one was a white wolf that came forward and looked him in the eye for several seconds and then left. And when he went back to the people told him, this is a sign, the old beloved men said, this is a sign that you have been chosen for some significance for your people. As we know that there was many trials starting a new government where there was no government in a wilderness for our people, because we too lived on cultivated homes and lands, and we had our tribal town forms of government. And to go and walk the Trail of Tears was a very much of a heartache, and many of the people wanted to die. And they said, we must go on because we have the seeds of our people within us. And if we die, they won't have a chance to live. So I am one of those that had a chance to live. And I'm so grateful that we're still here, that we can still tell our stories, and that we live on.
The descendants of those removed from their homelands hold the memory of these events close to their hearts. They continue to honor and remember their heritage and their past. Each day is its own testament to the human spirit and the will of the tribes to survive.
There is no celebration of leaving your home and signing a treaty and never being allowed to go back. By law, to be under that, to never go home again, to never see the graves of your people or the tribal towns where your medicine and your ceremonies take place. When we brought our fires and we brought those ancient plates and we started our towns anew in Oklahoma Indian Territory. In my own family, Oklahoma Indian Territory only lasted 3 generations, and we had to give up land again and be under the government, be dispersed, homeless, landless people. So to think about the Trail of Tears, it's not really a celebration, it's a memorial of our people.
Although the forced removal and the Trail of Tears was and remains one of the most horrific acts of ethnic cleansing and attempted genocide in American history, the Cherokee Nation prospers.
The Cherokee Nation, because of the removal of the Trail of Tears, we have 3 entities of tribal governments. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is the largest Indian tribe in the United States. We have over 316,000 tribal citizens today. The United Keetoowah Band of the Cherokee Indians have a population of about 16,000 or more in the state of Oklahoma, sharing the same land base as the Cherokee Nation. And in the great state of North Carolina, in the Smoky Mountains, is the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. Their population today is a little over 16,000 too. And together, we have over 348,000 tribal citizens of all 3 Cherokee entities of governments, and we are thriving in every field of opportunity our country has to this day, and continuing to prosper. Our people are doing very well with the culture, the traditions, the heritage, perpetuating it consistently with our people, and I am glad to and happy to be a part of that.
To be Cherokee, you need to think Cherokee, and it's a way of being connected to almost everything and involving the Creator in everything that you do. People ask me about our religion. I tell them we're religiously spiritual, and no matter what you do, the Creator's involved with that. And that's kind of the mindset that we had in the past, and balance is the objective of thinking Cherokee. The pride in being Cherokee and being connected to the land and to the culture to our language and our food and things like that is really a strong sense of being.
One will not hear the anguished voice of a forgotten and broken people. Instead, one might hear the pride of a people who faced overwhelming adversity and persevered.
I think it's important that we remember the Trail of Tears, because it's important for the Cherokees to remember, because although we had this great adversity and our forced removal happen to us, we did survive and adapt to our new lands, which has now become our homes, and have grown to a tribe of more than 300,000 citizens.
I'd like for people to understand that we're still here, that there's been an unbroken chain of connectedness to this land that we're still on and to the culture that we still are. So that's something that I really enjoy telling people and having them understand that we're still here.